Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. Today in our reading we come across Psalm 69, and this is a psalm that is quoted quite a bit in the New Testament. Matter of fact, as you read Psalm 69, you'll probably find some very familiar passages, such as verse 9, "For zeal for your house has consumed me." That one quoted in connection to Jesus cleansing the temple. Verse 21, "They also gave me gall for my food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink." Alluding to when Jesus was on the cross and they gave him something to drink. Verse 22, "May their table before them become a snare." Quoted in Romans chapter 11, talking about how the blessings that the Jewish nation had received became a snare to them. It became a stumbling block to them from accepting the very Messiah that they were promised. And these statements aren't made so much as, okay, David's going to sit down and he's going to write this prophecy about the Messiah. No, they just came out of his life, out of his circumstances, and this psalm flowed out of what he was going through at the time, which shows us something very interesting and something that is overlooked oftentimes. When it comes to prophecy, we typically think about words that were spoken, especially when it comes to prophecies about Christ. We think about prophecies that were spoken. We think about prophecies that were written down. But how many times do we think about lives that were prophetic? Prophetic lives that are in the Old Testament. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, David's, of course, a good example of this. Many of the circumstances that he was in and his responses to those circumstances closely mirror and look forward to and predicted a lot of the things that Jesus Christ would go through. We think about Psalm 22, which depicts the crucifixion in such detail, and yet it flowed out of something that David himself was experiencing. We looked as we studied the life of David and read about him here on our daily encounter. We talked about some of this, about what David was going through and how it alluded to Christ. But David's not the only one. Noah was also one who had certain parts of his life be prophetic, looking ahead to Christ. He built an ark in which the waters of the flood would not prevail against it, where Christ came and built a church where the gates of Hades would not prevail against it. We think about Joseph, him being thrown into the pit by his brothers, and then being pulled out, a figure of the death and the burial and the resurrection of Christ. And then you have him being seated at the right hand of Pharaoh, which alludes to Christ being seated at the right hand of the Father. You have Moses, whose life really closely mirrored and was prophetic in regards to Jesus' life. Hebrews chapter 3 compares Moses and Jesus quite a bit. We see him delivering the people from bondage, just as Christ delivered us from bondage. We see Moses guiding them through the wilderness as Christ guides us through the wilderness of this life. Many things tie Moses and Jesus together. And those are aspects of Moses' life that were prophetic. But as we look at Christ himself, who was the fulfillment of these prophecies, we can also see that Christ's own life is somewhat of a prophecy of our own experience. Because much of what Christ experienced while he was here on this earth, we as his church also experience in one way or the other. For instance, the persecution that Jesus underwent was something that would be also endured by the church. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus speaks this word to his disciples. He says, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master. It is enough for the disciple that he become like his teacher, and the slave like his master. If they called the head of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they malign the members of his household? Christ's sufferings, Christ's persecution, the fact that people hated Christ, even to the point of wanting to put him to death, is something that was looking forward to and ahead to the same sufferings that would happen in the church. The church has also been hated. Those who follow Christ have been despised and in many cases killed for their faith and their connection to Christ. So Christ came in his physical body here on the earth. God manifested in flesh. John chapter 1 teaches us. He came in the flesh. He was suffered and was persecuted and put to death in the flesh. But then he established his church, and his church continued his earthly existence here on this earth in human flesh, but through the church. And the church would become his body. So as Christ had a body while he was here on earth and walked here among us, taught us, and was persecuted and despised and looked down on, so his body, the church, experiences those things as well. We are the expression of Christ here on the earth. As Christ lives in us, as we express Christ, many times that brings opposition. And many times it brings persecution and trials and difficulties. But it's all us experiencing situations similar to Christ. And so as we look back at the Psalms, many times we can relate to the Psalms because the Psalms relate to Christ and Christ relates to us. And so we can look at the Psalms and look very closely. As you look at some of these Psalms that are against David's enemies, for instance, maybe sometimes we read those Psalms and maybe they connect to us very well. Maybe we have people here on this earth that come up against us, speak out against us, ridicule us, slander us, and rise up against us. And we can really relate to what David was experiencing or some of the other psalmists. But even if we don't have anyone physically who's coming against us, maybe you look at your life and you're pretty much free of enemies. Nobody really attacks you or speaks out against you. You have a pretty good relationship with everybody. Still, we can relate to the Psalms and relate to Christ's sufferings in that we have an enemy that is not of this world, an enemy that is not flesh and blood. In Ephesians chapter 6 in verse 10 says, "Finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places." So we can all relate to the Psalms that talk about enemies and how the enemies have risen up against us and how we want the Lord to overtake our enemies and deliver us from our enemies. All those relate to us because we have a very real enemy that is working behind the scenes. Even though we can't see him and we can't see those who work with him, these world forces of the darkness, the rulers, the powers, all these things mentioned in Ephesians 6, doesn't make them any less real. And so we can, again, relate with Jesus, relate with David, relate with all who have suffered here on this earth because of their faith, because we too have enemies. So these are just some things to think about. To kind of think about these prophetic lives, the prophetic lives of the Old Testament saints who look forward to Christ, of Christ's prophetic life that looks forward to future sufferings that his body would endure. All of this is tied together, and it gives us a mutual fellowship in these sufferings, and a mutual fellowship in our ability to place our trust and our hope in our God. So I thank you guys for listening in today. I hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.